Hi guys, how are you today? After a hard-working day, let's relax with this journey through history. We will travel back to the Middle Ages, a time filled with knighthood, chivalry and struggles, both noble and grim. As we settle into the past, take a deep breath and allow the rhythms of history to guide you into a gentle exploration of what life was really like for a knight. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Middle Ages together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. In the Middle Ages, surgery was very different from what we know today. There were no sterile operating rooms, no sharp, polished instruments, and no trained anesthesiologists. Instead, medical knowledge was sparse, and the methods used were often rudimentary, shaped by trial and error. Imagine yourself in this distant time when medical practices were still in their infancy and the understanding of the human body was limited. You lie in a quiet room, perhaps on a rough wooden table, waiting for the procedure to begin. The room is dimly lit by flickering candlelight, the air heavy with the scent of herbs and damp stone. There are no sterile gloves, no clean sheets. Instead, you find yourself at the mercy of the barber surgeon, the only person available to tend to your wounds. The room feels still, the outside world distant. And yet, this was the reality for many who lived during these times. As we move through this chapter of history, we will take a slow, careful look at what it might have been like to face surgery in such an uncertain, unfamiliar world. No rush, no hurry. Just the steady passage of time as we reflect on the past. In the Middle Ages, the understanding of medicine was still in its earliest stages. The human body, its functions, and its ailments were mysteries, often explained through the lens of superstition and faith. The scientific discoveries we take for granted today were far from the minds of those living at the time. Instead, medicine was a blend of tradition, trial, and error, passed down from generation to generation. Doctors, if they could be called that, were few in number. Those who practiced medicine often learned from their masters, but there were no universities or schools dedicated to the study of medicine as we know them now. Knowledge was fragmented, sometimes relying more on ancient texts and folklore than on practical experience. The people of the time had no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or the role of cleanliness in health. Wounds were often treated with salves made from herbs, some of which had healing properties, but many of which were ineffective or even harmful. Bloodletting, a practice believed to balance the body's humours, was common, though its effectiveness was unknown. In this world, there was little distinction between the fields of barbering and surgery. Barber surgeons, as they were called, were the primary medical practitioners, although their skills were rudimentary. They were the ones who set bones, extracted teeth, and performed minor surgeries, but their training was not in anatomy or the finer details of surgery, and their tools were often little more than what one might find in a household. Barber surgeons were central figures in medieval medical life. They were not just the ones who cut hair, but also the ones who performed some of the most basic surgeries. If a person had a wound, a broken bone, or needed a tooth pulled, it was the barber surgeon who would be called upon. In many ways, the role of the barber surgeon was a reflection of the limited knowledge of the time. They were not educated in the ways we think of today, but instead learned through hands-on experience and observation. The skills they practiced were often passed down informally. They did not have textbooks or anatomical diagrams, and their understanding of the human body was based on crude observation rather than scientific research. Their instruments were simple and often crude: scalpels, saws, and clamps. These tools, while functional, were far from the precise instruments we use today. A barber surgeon might have to rely on what was at hand, sometimes improvising with tools meant for other purposes. The setting, too, was far from sterile. Procedures were often performed in small, dimly lit rooms, sometimes with no more than the light of a candle to guide the surgeon's hands. One of the most striking aspects of medieval surgery was the absence of hygiene. There was no understanding of germs or the importance of sterilization. Instruments were often used on multiple patients without any attempt to clean them. Bandages, if they were used at all, were sometimes reused or made from materials that offered little protection against infection. Wounds were left uncovered, exposed to the air and to the risk of infection. Infection was a constant threat. In the absence of antibiotics, even a small wound could become deadly. There was little to no understanding of how infections spread or how they could be prevented. The practice of washing hands before surgery, for example, was unheard of, and the idea of sterilizing instruments was far beyond the reach of medieval knowledge. For those who underwent surgery, the risk of infection was ever present. A simple cut could lead to sepsis, and the lack of effective treatment meant that many did not survive even the most minor procedures. The wounds from a surgery could easily become festering, causing the patient to suffer for days or even weeks before succumbing to illness. Despite the lack of formal medical knowledge, medieval society had a rich tradition of herbalism. People relied heavily on plants and natural remedies to treat ailments, often turning to local herbalists or wise women for guidance. These remedies, though primitive, were sometimes effective, and many herbs were known to have healing properties. Herbal remedies were used to treat everything from fever to pain. For wounds, poultices made from herbs were applied, though their true healing power was often unknown. Some of these remedies, like willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, were effective in relieving pain, while others, though well-meaning, did little to ease the suffering of patients. Herbalists were often highly regarded in their communities, though their practices were not always accepted by the more formal medical practitioners. Despite the limited understanding of medicine, these wise women and men played a crucial role in the everyday healing of the people. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, though much of it was based on trial and error rather than scientific understanding. When we look back at the state of medicine in the Middle Ages, it is easy to feel a sense of disbelief at how far we've come. What was considered cutting-edge knowledge then seems rudimentary, even primitive to us now. And yet, these early practices laid the foundation for the advancements that would follow. The barber surgeons, the herbalists, and the people who lived through these times did not have the benefit of modern medicine or the scientific understanding we now rely on. And yet, they carried on, doing the best they could with the tools and knowledge they had. They faced their challenges with resilience, and their efforts, however imperfect, paved the way for the medical breakthroughs that would one day save countless lives. As we reflect on this time, we are reminded of the fragile nature of human knowledge and the slow, steady progress that has brought us to where we are today. There was no rush, no urgency to the practices of the past. Everything unfolded at its own pace, and the lessons learned from one generation to the next were passed along in their own quiet, patient way. Perhaps, in this gentleness, there is something to be learned, an understanding that progress takes time, and that the journey, no matter how slow, is always moving forward. The preparation for surgery in the Middle Ages was far from the controlled, sterile environment we are familiar with today. There was no countdown to a precise moment, no surgical team moving in sync, and no clean operating rooms. Instead, the process was slow, often uncertain, and filled with quiet anticipation. As a patient in these times, you would not be rushed. The day might begin like any other, until the moment you are told that surgery is necessary. There would be no sudden flurry of activity, no loud instructions or hurried movements. Instead, the day would unfold in its own time. You would likely be asked to prepare yourself, not physically but mentally. The reality of what was about to happen would be slowly sinking in. There would be no comforting words from a medical team. The surgeon, or barber surgeon, would arrive in the quiet, dimly lit room. Perhaps there would be a brief conversation, a mention of what the procedure would entail, but it would be simple and direct. You would likely be asked to lie down, and the room might feel strangely still, the air thick with an unspoken sense of what was to come. The smell of herbs, alcohol, and the coldness of stone walls would be your only companions as you waited. The first step in preparing for surgery would likely involve some form of sedation, though nothing as effective as what we have today. There were no modern anesthetics. Instead, alcohol was often the primary means of dulling the senses. A glass of wine or strong ale might be offered to you to help ease the fear, though the relief it brought would be minimal. Herbal remedies also played a role in these preparations. Plants with calming or numbing properties, such as poppy or mandrake, might be used to prepare the patient, though these herbs were not always reliable. They were often brewed into potions or brewed into teas. The herbalist or the surgeon might also rub the herbs into your skin, hoping that they would ease some of the tension and dull the sharper edges of your nerves. However, there was no certainty in these methods. The strength of the herbs varied, and the effects of alcohol were often fleeting. The patient might feel a sense of relaxation, but there was always the underlying knowledge that what was about to happen could not be fully masked. Pain, though dulled, was still an inevitable companion in the procedure. Once the patient had been given some measure of sedation, the surgeon would begin preparing the tools. The small, often makeshift medical kit would be opened. Simple, utilitarian instruments would be arranged on a nearby table or cloth, each tool waiting to serve its purpose. The surgeon's tools would be few in number. A small knife, a saw, clamps, and perhaps a needle and thread for suturing would be part of the set. Each instrument had its own distinct function, but the difference in precision, compared to today's surgical tools, would be immediately apparent. The tools, while functional, were rudimentary, and their edges, whether dull or sharp, had not been sharpened with the precision we take for granted. The surgeon would work slowly, perhaps cleaning the tools with cloth or washing them in water. There was no practice of sterilization, no knowledge of germs or infection. The tools, though, would at least be prepared for the job at hand. The cold metal of the instruments might reflect the flickering light of the candles or torches in the room, casting shadows that stretched across the stone floor. The sight of these tools might bring a sense of unease, though the lack of urgency would allow time for quiet reflection. You would know what was coming, but there would be no rushing. The preparation for surgery was slow, deliberate, and unhurried. The patient, in their quiet wait, might feel the weight of time pass with each moment. While the surgeon prepared, the presence of family members might provide a sense of comfort, though not of the sort we would expect today. Loved ones might sit nearby, offering quiet support, perhaps holding your hand or whispering prayers for strength and guidance. The room, though cold and simple, would be filled with the silent presence of those who cared for you. It was common in medieval times for family to be involved in the care of the patient, especially in times of illness or surgery. While there was no modern support system like nurses or specialists, the patient would often rely on the compassion and familiarity of family members. These loved ones would not have medical knowledge, but their presence would be a reminder that you were not entirely alone. This quiet presence would be the emotional preparation that took place before the surgery began. Though they could not take away the fear or provide any comfort in the way we might imagine today, their support would be tangible, a steadying force in the midst of uncertainty. Their voices, soft and calming, would be a gentle reminder that while the procedure ahead was uncertain, there was still a thread of connection to the world outside the room. As the patient lay there, waiting for the procedure to begin, time might stretch endlessly. The air would be still, the only sounds the flickering of the candle flames and the distant murmur of family members. There would be no rush, no frenetic movement. Everything would unfold slowly, in its own time. The preparation was as much a part of the surgery as the operation itself, quiet, deliberate, and unhurried. Unlike the modern, fast-paced world of surgery, where everything happens in a carefully timed sequence, the Middle Ages allowed for a more measured approach. The preparation was not just about the body, but about the mind as well. There was time to reflect, to prepare, and to accept that what was coming could not be avoided. There was no excitement, no tension, just a steady progression from one moment to the next. In the end, the patient's experience was not one of frantic movement, but of slow, inevitable passage. In the end, the patient's experience was not one of frantic movement, but of slow, inevitable passage. And in this calmness, in this quiet waiting, there was perhaps a space to find acceptance, to gather strength, and to face the unknown with a sense of stillness. Once the patient has been prepared and the tools are laid out, the moment of surgery begins, not with a rush, but with a quiet acceptance of what is to come. There is no flurry of activity, no hurried movements, only the steady hands of the barber surgeon as they prepare for the task at hand. The room remains still, save for the occasional shift of the surgeon or the soft murmur of a family member nearby. The surgeon would approach with a calm, methodical pace. The patient, perhaps slightly sedated by the herbal concoctions or alcohol they had consumed earlier, may feel a dull sense of detachment from the scene unfolding. The room remains dim, the only illumination coming from flickering candles, casting soft, dancing shadows on the stone walls. There is no hurried countdown, no sense of urgency. The moment has arrived, and the surgeon moves with quiet precision, each motion deliberate and slow. The lack of medical knowledge and tools does not equate to a lack of care. There is a simple focus here, to do the job with the means at hand, no more, no less. The surgeon's tools are simple, often no more than knives, saws, and clamps. These are not the sleek, carefully designed instruments of modern surgery, but rather functional, rudimentary tools, each serving its intended purpose. The knife might be used to cut through flesh, the saw to slice through bone. The clamps could hold open a wound or prevent bleeding, and a needle, perhaps fashioned from bone or metal, would stitch the patient's skin back together once the procedure was completed. Each tool has been prepared and placed carefully on a cloth or wooden table, and the surgeon chooses each one methodically. There is no rush to this decision. The surgeon does not need to consider an array of advanced instruments or modern techniques. Instead, they rely on the simplicity and functionality of the tools in front of them. The cold metal of the instruments reflects the candlelight, and their sharpness, while not precise, is enough to carry out the task. The patient, lying quietly, may hear the slight scrape of metal against bone, the sound of the surgeon's steady hand working. But there is no panic in the air. Everything proceeds at its own pace, moving forward with calm precision. As the procedure continues, the room remains oddly quiet. The surgeon, focused on the task at hand, works in a rhythm, each motion steady and controlled. There are no sounds of machines, no beeping monitors or alarms. The only sound is that of the surgeon's hands moving, the occasional scrape of metal on bone, and perhaps the soft breath of the patient. The family members, if they remain in the room, watch in quiet silence. Their presence offers no interference, no demand for speed or efficiency. In these moments, there is no need for conversation. The act of surgery, as primitive as it may seem, unfolds in a space of stillness. The room, the tools, the patient, and the surgeon, each part of the whole, moving together in an unspoken understanding that this is simply what must be done. The lack of urgency feels almost soothing. There is no tension, no sense of hurry. The surgeon's actions are deliberate, almost methodical, yet there is no rushing. Everything happens in its own time, and in that time, the patient remains still, perhaps too numbed to fully grasp the experience unfolding around them. The moment continues, and with it, the steady, unbroken rhythm of the procedure. Once the surgery is complete, there is a quiet resolution. The surgeon may pause, taking a moment to assess the outcome, the work now finished. The tools, once carefully used, are set aside. The task is done, not with the perfection of modern techniques, but with the certainty that it has been completed with the means available. The room, now with its task fulfilled, seems to return to its previous stillness. The candles continue to flicker in their quiet dance, and the stone walls stand as silent witnesses to the event that has just transpired. There is no rush to remove the patient from the table, or to proclaim the success of the surgery. The surgeon may stand for a moment, reflecting on the procedure, perhaps speaking softly to the patient, but the overall atmosphere remains one of calm. Once the surgery is over, the patient is often left to rest, perhaps still lying on the table or moved to a bed nearby. There is no rush to awaken them or to examine the results immediately. The quiet, gentle recovery process is as important as the procedure itself. In the absence of modern monitoring or surgical teams, the patient's body must be given time to heal in its own way, at its own pace. The surgery itself in the Middle Ages was not a quick event. The procedures were often simple, yet they were carried out with such a gentle, deliberate pace. The lack of medical advancements meant that there was no expectation of perfection, no speed to the process. Everything unfolded as it had to, in its own time. The slow, deliberate pace of the procedure reflects a time when medicine was as much about patience as it was about skill. The surgeon's hand, though skilled, did not have the benefit of modern technology or understanding. Yet, in its simplicity, the procedure was a testament to human resilience. There was no rush to finish, no need to hurry. In this quiet, calm room, the patient, the surgeon, and the few witnesses were part of a shared moment that passed slowly, inevitably, and without haste. The work was done, but there was no need for applause or celebration. Everything continued as it always had, at its own rhythm. As we reflect on this, we see that the pace of life in the past was different. It moved slowly, with purpose and intention, but without the urgency we often associate with modern life. In this simplicity, there is a lesson to be learned. that some things must unfold in their own time, at their own pace, and that, in such moments, there is peace. In times of war, the environment of surgery shifted, though not by much. The sterile rooms and quiet spaces of the town or village were replaced by the chaotic and often brutal surroundings of the battlefield. The surgeon, usually a barber surgeon or field medic, was no longer working in the safety of a quiet room, but in tents or hastily built shelters surrounded by the noise of war. The sounds of battle would still be faintly heard in the distance, as soldiers lay on the rough cots, awaiting treatment. These were not patients who had the luxury of time or comfort. In fact, there was no time to waste, but still, no rush. Everything unfolded slowly, in a manner that felt almost meditative in its quietness, despite the overwhelming circumstances. The soldiers, most of whom had been injured in some way, would lie patiently, waiting for the attention they desperately needed. There was no shouting, no frenzied atmosphere. Instead, the atmosphere was filled with an underlying calmness, a strange sense of inevitability. Injuries were treated as best as they could be, with whatever means were available. The surgeon, though surrounded by the grim reminders of war, continued to perform the same duties they had in peace. The process was unhurried, steady, and deliberate. The tools used in battlefield surgery were no different from those in the towns. There was no gleaming array of modern medical instruments, only what the surgeon had at hand. The kit might include a sharp knife, a simple saw, clamps to stop bleeding, and perhaps a needle and thread to stitch wounds. These were the same instruments that had been used in peacetime, yet their role was now crucial in a setting where speed and precision were more important than ever. The surgeon's movements were deliberate, slow, and almost mechanical. Their hands, though experienced, did not have the luxury of time. While they worked, the air would be thick with the smell of blood, the earthy scent of the ground beneath, and perhaps the faint smoke of a fire in the distance. It was a reminder that life here was fragile, and that every moment could be one of quiet, careful survival. Though there were no anesthetics, and though the patient's pain could not be fully alleviated, the procedure continued as it always had. The surgeon would be focused on their task, not rushing yet not dwelling on the fear or the pain that surrounded them. The wounds would be cleaned, sometimes using little more than water and cloth, and then treated with the tools available. Each movement was essential, though never hurried. The process was steady, an inevitable part of the soldier's journey through pain and recovery. After the procedure was completed, the patient was often left to recover in a makeshift hospital, a tent or temporary shelter that offered little comfort. Unlike in a town or village where there was a chance to heal at home, the battlefield did not provide this luxury. The recovery was as uncertain as the surgery itself. Without the ability to offer real post-operative care, the soldiers would often lie in a quiet state of rest, waiting for the body to heal as best it could. The family or comrades of the injured soldier would often stay close, offering their support in any way they could. Sometimes they might bring food or water, or perhaps hold the soldier's hand while they rested. The room would remain quiet, the only sounds being the occasional whispers of friends and the distant echoes of the battlefield. The wounded soldier, now in a state of calm rest, would have little choice but to wait, just as the surgeon had worked slowly and steadily before. The care provided after surgery was simple, often involving basic bandages and herbal remedies if available. There was no luxury of a hospital bed or sterile environment. The patient's body was left to fight the infection or heal the wound on its own. The army's medics or field surgeons would only return if necessary, offering further care when they could, but otherwise, it was a quiet time for the injured to rest, their bodies in the hands of fate as much as the surgeons. The healing process in such a setting was slow and often uncertain. The battlefield was not a place for immediate recovery, and even minor wounds could become infected in the unsanitary conditions. The soldier's body would be forced to work at its own pace, with no modern treatments available to assist. The hands of the surgeon were steady, but their tools were primitive, and their knowledge of infection or healing was limited. Yet, despite the primitive nature of this care, there was still something reassuring in the steady rhythm of the work. The surgeon moved with purpose, performing each step of the procedure as best they could, even in a world filled with uncertainty. Their experience guided them, but it was the patience of the patient and the surgeon alike that allowed this quiet, fragile process to continue. As the soldiers healed, or sometimes did not, they would pass through the days in a strange sort of rhythm, waiting for time to heal their wounds, both physical and emotional. The surgery was simply one step in the long journey of recovery, and sometimes that journey would end sooner than expected. But in the time that remained, the soldiers would lie quietly, recovering in whatever small ways their bodies allowed. Though surgery in war was filled with its own challenges, there was still a deep sense of calm in the process. The surgeon, though surrounded by chaos, continued to work in the same way they had before. The patient, though enduring great pain, could only wait patiently for the healing to begin. And in that quiet waiting, the process of healing moved forward, step by step. The slow, deliberate nature of battlefield surgery reminds us of the timelessness of human resilience. Whether in peace or war, the human body and spirit move through pain and suffering with a quiet acceptance. There is no rush to recovery. Healing, like the work of the surgeon, happens in its own time, at its own pace. And though the surroundings may be harsh, the steady hand of the surgeon and the quiet endurance of the patient make the journey possible. In this slow process, there is no hurry. Time moves gently, allowing the body to heal, bit by bit, as it always has. And in the end, the quiet continuation of life, even amidst the chaos, is the final testament to the strength of the human spirit. Once the surgery was over, whether in the peaceful confines of a home or amidst the rough conditions of a battlefield, the patient would be left to recover in their own time. There was no rushing to the next procedure, no rush of activity. The room would remain still, perhaps quieter now, with only the gentle flicker of candlelight or the distant sounds of the world outside. The recovery was slow, sometimes almost imperceptible. The patient would lie still, wrapped in blankets, perhaps feverish or weak, with only the occasional visit from a healer, herbalist, or surgeon. There was no immediate sense of improvement, just the slow, steady passage of time. The body would do its work, at its own pace, guided by the patient's own resilience, but there was little that could be done to hasten the process. In these moments, there was a peaceful stillness, as if time itself moved at a different rhythm. The patient might be fed broths or herbal teas, but for the most part, healing came from within. There was no rush to see results, just a quiet waiting, allowing the body to heal in its own way. In medieval times, the threat of infection was ever present. The understanding of germs and bacteria was non-existent, and even the simplest of wounds could turn into life-threatening illnesses. There were no antibiotics to prevent infections, and the concept of sterile procedures was far from anyone's mind. As a result, the recovery process was fraught with uncertainty. The body's natural defense mechanisms were the only tools available to fight infection. If the wound began to swell or turn red, it was a clear sign that something was amiss. There were no quick remedies to cure infection. The patient would be left to rest while the infection, should it take root, might gradually worsen. Herbal remedies were often the last line of defense. A poultice of herbs might be applied to the wound, or the patient might be given a concoction of plants thought to have healing properties. Yet, these remedies were not always effective, and the patient's fate lay more in the strength of their own body than in the hands of their healer. Above all, rest was the most important part of the recovery process. There were no high-tech medical devices to monitor the patient's progress, no fast-acting drugs to relieve pain or accelerate healing. Instead, time itself played a key role in recovery. The patient would lie still, perhaps sleeping most of the day, the quiet rhythm of their breathing marking the passage of time. Family members or fellow soldiers might sit by their side, offering what comfort they could, but the true work of healing was done within the patient's body. The internal processes, invisible to the eye, would slowly but steadily mend the damage caused by the surgery. It was a patient process, one that unfolded in its own time. The patient, wrapped in warmth and darkness, would be left to rest, their body using the time to repair itself in the only way it knew how. Looking back, the recovery from surgery in the Middle Ages was not a swift process. The patient's body worked at its own pace, guided by the slow rhythms of nature. Healing was not guaranteed, and survival was often a matter of chance. Yet, there was a certain calm in this slow process. The absence of modern intervention, while unsettling, allowed for a deep connection to the body's natural rhythms. There was no rushing, no pressing need to finish the recovery quickly. Everything unfolded as it had to, step by step. This slow journey through recovery, with all its uncertainties and risks, is a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of the human body. Each day passed slowly, with no rush to the finish line. The quiet waiting, the restful moments, were as much a part of the healing process as the surgery itself. In these moments, there was a subtle reflection on the slow, steady march of time, unrushed, unhurried, yet moving forward, no matter the pace. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.